Hello, and welcome to my course, Economics for Business. This is Module 5. It's about mapping data to what you need. So in the last module, we saw some economic data sources, and we saw how the economic data is constructed and how you might use it. And if you remember back to the first module, we looked at what your business needs might be. So this module is kind of all about mapping what we looked at last module to what we looked at in the first module. And by the end of this module, I want you to understand kind of how we do that mapping. So we're going to be using the Great Beer Guys case study again. The case study is linked at the bottom of the course notes. And if you remember from the case study and remember from module 1, the business research question we came up with for Great Beer Guys was, what will be the average rate of change in barley prices in the USA over the next 5 years? So I've made a bit of a framework which is linked at the bottom of the course page again. And that's just based on some of my experience of how I've several times gone from figuring out what a business research question might be to figuring out what data exists and how to map that data to what I actually need. So the first step is you want to recognize keywords. So for our question, what will be the average rate of change in barley prices in the USA over the next 5 years? When I look at that, I can see kind of 5 keywords. Maybe there's more, maybe you can combine some for something interesting, but for me it's 5. The first one I see is average, which is a statistical word, and then rate of change, which is a specific measure of what we want, and actually maybe even average rate of change is interesting in itself. The next word is prices, so I know we want some price data. Next is barley, okay, so we want barley prices specifically. And then the final keyword is the USA. And so it's like, okay, I want data from America that describes barley prices. I want data that is published in such a way that I can calculate a rate of change or an average rate of change. And for me, that means the data that I want is very obvious. Kind of based on experience, I know that the Federal Reserve economic data has a series called Producer Price Indices by Commodity for barley prices specifically. So that's the data I want. So that what we just went through was how I map what I know of available data to the data I need. And this comes with experience. So I've used Fred many times. I've used Fred for barley prices specifically. I've used it for other commodity prices. So I know what exists, and I know what kind of is on there, and I also understand my business research question deeply. And that comes with experience. So what we want to do is we want to go to the Fred and find the dataset that we need. So I'm on the Fred website, and it has a search bar here. So if we go producer price indices, barley, any combination of those keywords really. And it comes up with this page. So this has got 2 available data sets, which is a good sign. And then we just want to check when the data sets start and when they end. So like what's going to be the first observation, and really importantly, what's going to be the last? Are they going to be up to date? So for these 2 series, the first one has an end date of December 2017. Is a bit bad for us. And then the second one is an end date of December 2003. And it's kind of even worse. And this is a bit of a bad sign. These series are both discontinued, but actually the Fred has provided this button called 2 other formats, so there's some other data available. And we can see in this new data that's available, there are 2 options. One begins in 1947 and one begins in 1971. That's kind of secondary to what we need. But the primary thing we're looking for is when does the data end? When is that last observation? Is it current? And both of these data sources, really good news, they're both current. So they both end in October 2024. So I'm going to click the second one, which begins in 1971 and ends in October 2024. And now you can see why the Federal Reserve economic data is so well liked by so many professional economists. As soon as you click any data series on this website, I'm pretty sure it's any of them, or it's at least most of them, the website's designed to graph them automatically. And then really nicely, the Fred includes periods when there was an official recession, kind of defined as 2 or more periods kind of together that GDP growth has been negative. And so we can see there was a bit of a recession in 1973 to about 1975. Yeah, that was a long time ago. So we can see 2008, the Great Financial Crisis is in a shaded area, and the last one, which was the crisis caused by the response to COVID, which is in around 2020. And so those areas are shaded on the graph, and that's a piece of analysis that's kind of not so interesting for our course, but a lot of macroeconomists and professional economists really like to understand data series in the context of like other macro events, and the Fred data kind of automatically tracks that, which is really nice. Anyway, so what we want to do is we actually want to download this data because we want to use it later. So for me, when I download economic data, I usually like a period of 10 years. So, 1971 to 2024, it's a little bit long. There's a lot of observations. Periods before, kind of observations before 2010, now that we're in 2024, that feels a long time ago, right? So for me, I'm going to think, well, okay, I want about 10 years of data. 10 years of data kind of feels right when you're doing economic analyses. And again, that comes with experience. So I'll click the 10 up here, just to make it 10 years, and then we can see that the data now starts in October 2014 and goes to October 2024. Now I'm recording this on the 30th of November 2024, so I suspect that within the next few days, or maybe even next few weeks, that there will be a November measure for this, and that's fine. So we want to download the data, we'll click this download button. We've got several options to download it. You can download it in a CSV, delineated file, an Excel file, an image for the graph, or a PowerPoint for the graph. For me, I always download Excel files from Fred. So I want you to go ahead and download that. Okay. Now that we've got the data and we've mapped our keywords to the dataset that we want, the next step we want to figure out is, well, what happens if we couldn't find any data? We actually really easily found that data on barley prices, right? But what if our business research question was really specific or was about a country that doesn't track data? What if we were asking for the average price of barley for a small South American country that doesn't track the data, which is quite common in smaller countries? For me, if I was going to answer that question, I would think, well, I would look for proxies, this idea of like, what is the thing I can use instead of? And that's a proxy. So when I think through this process, I ask, well, what would be the perfect data? What data would describe exactly what I want? Kind of ignoring any constraints about what data exists and what's available. And then now that I've got that kind of in my mind, some ideas, you don't need to write them down specifically, but it might help. For me, I like to keep the ideas kind of ephemeral, or like a cloud of ideas in my mind that isn't quite in words. It just works better for me. And then I think, well, okay, now that I know what the perfect data would look like, what is some data that I can kind of kludge together that I know exists and kind of use some acceptable assumptions that might kind of come together and look almost perfect, or close enough, right? So again, for example, if barley prices were not tracked in your country of interest, could you just use prices of grain in general? Because often statistical series are kind of aggregated, and so maybe barley isn't tracked and published, but maybe the statistical agency publishes a series called grain prices, and maybe that's okay. Kind of the implicit assumption there is like, well, maybe we're assuming that barley prices move in the same direction as grain prices in general, and that's probably a good assumption. Or kind of failing that, we go one step deeper. Oh, okay. So what would we do if even that's not available? Well, then maybe we might look in the import and export data, assuming that's available, and we might find, maybe we've got a count of how many tons of barley are imported into the country we're looking at, and then we can also find data, usually in the same data sets, on the total cost of importing that barley. And we divide that by the other and find the kind of average price for each ton of barley imported. Okay, that's an option, and that's a pretty good option actually. But then, what if even that's not available? Because some countries just don't publish their statistical series at all. Then we're still not stuck. We kind of know, based on kind of trade patterns and what we understand of kind of purchasing power parity and other economic theories, we know that we can look at a country like Australia or the USA, which both export a lot of barley, and so does Canada. So we can look at both of those, well, kind of all three of those countries, and we can find the total tonnage of barley exported and find the total receipts from barley exported. And we can divide one by the other and calculate the average price of barley when it's exported. And then you would kind of make an assumption, well, we kind of know that purchasing power of commodities tends to equalize across the earth because of arbitrageurs. And so we know that the export price of barley from a country that exports barley is going to be approximately the same as the import price, or what it costs our beer manufacturer to buy barley. There will be discrepancies, but at least it moves in the same direction. And as I said, we're finding a proxy, and as you kind of go deep into that proxy process, the data becomes less and less perfect, and it's just something you have to live with. The next step is kind of this idea that you do want to focus on what's available. You really don't want to go chasing primary data that you need to collect yourself. 1, because it's expensive. 2, because it's expensive. 3, because it's expensive. So really we now want to prioritize kind of what's the easiest to access. So for economic data specifically, everything's all standardized. No one really has any data that no one else does. It's just different agencies choose to publish different data, which is interesting because everyone it's all the same stuff. But you want to kind of prioritize platforms where it's the easiest to find and the easiest to download. For me, the kind of 2 clear winners on both of those cases are Statistics New Zealand. Huge shout out to them. They do such a good job with their website. And the Fred, again, fantastic, easy to use website for someone who kind of knows. As long as you know kind of what you're looking for, both of these websites are amazing. The Australian Bureau of Statistics, or ABS, their website is only slightly less easy to use, but again, they've got a lot of fantastic data. And I know from experience that the ABS kind of publish the data that they do publish and is available for download. Once you figure out where it is and exactly which one you want, when you download it, it's actually in a much more useful format than either of Stats New Zealand or Fred. So that's interesting. And then kind of, once you've got the data, you kind of want to manipulate it in some sense. You want to add some stuff together, divide some stuff, whatever you want to do, calculate whatever statistics you want. And so for Reggie, for the Great Beer guys, we wanted the average rate of change for the next 5 years. So what we would do is we would take, what's been the rate of change for the previous 5 years, and we'll just calculate that. And then I'll walk you through the process of how to do that in the next module. But this is just to give you an idea of, use what's available, and these are some ideas of how to use it. Then kind of step 4 is you want to visualize the data. So you should always go for the simplest analysis first, and then if there is anything interesting, following that simple process, then dig into other stuff. And that comes with experience. So it's usually going to be time series analysis to just spot some trends. Saying time series analysis kind of overcomplicates it. Really, all we're looking for is patterns. Humans are amazing at finding patterns. And you kind of want to communicate whatever patterns you find using, again, the simplest way you can for your audience. And for trends, it's going to be line charts. So on the right here is a line chart of the producer price index for barley for around October 2014 to October 2024. And we can see the trend is kind of non-existent, really. Over the whole series, the trend kind of doesn't exist. But there are periods when it does trend in very interesting ways. So even if we kind of ignore the 2020 era, right? If we just focus on, say, 2014 to 2016, there's kind of this downward trend. Then 16 to kind of 18-ish is an upward trend, and you see these kind of these microstructures, I guess, if you want to call them. And then Step 5, now that you've got the data, you've visualized it, you've found some interesting things, now you want to kind of go over it again. You want to iterate and iterate and iterate and fill gaps as much as you can until you can't fill any of your gaps or any more of your gaps. So if you've used a proxy because you couldn't find the perfect data source, you really want to be critical of what assumptions you've made. So maybe it might be helpful to list out your assumptions, put them on post-it notes, and just go through one at a time and say, is this assumption plausible? For example, I went through the example where barley prices were not publicly available, and so I assumed we might use grain prices in general. And an implicit assumption, if we did that, would be, well, can we actually assume that barley prices follow grain prices? That's a pretty plausible assumption. That's an easy one. They probably do. It's good. And then we also need to assume, well, actually, we know grain prices will grow in general, and we know barley prices will probably grow too. But can we assume they're going to grow around about the same? That's not such an easy assumption to make. We would make that assumption just because we would have no other option, but there's a few caveats you would need to include with your analysis there. Maybe grain prices on average might be more influenced by other grains, obviously, such as rice or wheat or spelt. Just these other grains which their prices might move in such a way that the average prices of grains in general moves a lot differently than barley prices. And that might be interesting. And finally, you kind of want to find as much data as you can, although I have said that you kind of want one data set for each business research question. You kind of want to, you're not adding any data into your analysis here, but you're kind of couching it and contextualizing it yourself by finding more data to refine the analysis. If it feels kind of incomplete, like if you've used a proxy, say again, like just grain prices in general, if we've used that and we found some results and maybe they don't look quite right, maybe somehow we know more about barley prices than the publicly available data, so your personal experience can come into context here. And you might want to say, well, can we do anything else? Can we add some data in for some context? Can we maybe revisit our proxies? Can we find an additional data set to do some more data manipulation? Does that make sense? Will it add anything? In my case, we found some actually really good data, which is the prices of barley for 2014 to 2024. It's clean data from the Fred. We know it measures kind of exactly what we want. So ours is pretty complete. We don't need to add anything to the Great Beer Guys case study. And then finally, you want to kind of deliver your analysis, including your calculations. So for the Great Beer Guys, we would calculate the percentage change in prices for the last 5 years. So that would start in sort of 2019, which is around here, and calculate the average rate of change. Then we're going to make an explicit assumption that the rate of change in prices will remain the same for the next 5 years. We don't know anything else because it's the future, right? But we can probably make this assumption, and then we just apply that model, or that calculation, to the barley data, and make a nice graph. And that's all I've done in this graph to the right. So my forecast, based on this very simple model, and based on the assumption that the rate of change will remain the same for the next 5 years, I've said that barley prices will increase by about 0.16% every month. So, kind of casting that out, then we see that in around about 2029, in October 2029, we might expect that barley prices would be kind of around about the same level that they were nearing the end of 2020. So, in summary for this module, basically we want to map what the data that we already know that exists to our business research question. We want to use the easiest to find data first, and we kind of want to use the best data that we can find first. And if we can't find anything, then we'll look for a proxy and we'll go through that process again. And then finally, once we've got data that we think is good enough, then we want to manipulate the data in whichever way we need and make whatever assumptions we need to make to kind of create a data series and create a forecast that's actually useful for us. So that's the end of this module. I'll see you in the next one.